Good afternoon. This is, I think, more or less at the time that I was doing these, but again, my schedule's erratic these days. This week we're going to be talking about Parshat Lecha, and I've entitled this A Precedent for Perseverance. So I'm going to ask you to recall that when I first spoke about the focus for this year with the Haftara, when you have a Haftara, two things to remember. Number one, there's always some nuanced, usually a linguistic connection between the Torah portion and the Haftarah portion. And the second thing to remember is how, when, and why they began to read Haftarah, because they were forbidden to read from the Torah by various rulers at different points, and therefore they read these prophetic texts, which were not part of the prohibition, but through a linguistic and or thematic tie, it connected them and reminded them so they would not forget the Torah itself. This week's portion, this week's Haftarah, is again from Yeshayahu, chapter 40, verse 27 through 41, verse 16. And we're going to begin by looking at some symmetry between chapter 14, verses 13 through 16 in our Torah text, and chapter 41, right in the middle of the Haftarah, verses 2 and 3. So we're going to begin with Yeshayahu. We're told, Hacharishu Elai, listen to me, be silent, in order to hear my words. That's why they are being told to be silent, according to the prophet. This is during exile. There's been many difficulties. Remember that rega katan that's going to come in here. A small moment may be a catastrophic change in our lives, and we all certainly understand that today. So then we read, who brought up from the east? The one who was righteous. And this will be a reference to Avram. We will see many references in Yeshayahu who's speaking to these exiles, who's speaking to these people that are dealing with major crises and fear and not knowing what tomorrow is going to bring in their lives, and evoking those feelings from the Avot, starting with Avram as he began. Who aroused Avraham? Mi he'ir et Avraham lahavihu me Aram, shahu b'mizrach, who comes from Aram, which is in the east. And think about that. When we begin the narrative of the Pesach Seder, we say the Aramean, my father Avraham. So we have to remember what his roots are. He had this. We don't think about this in looking at Avram. What it meant to leave certainty to move to uncertainty. We're seeing this in our world today, of course, with what's going on in Israel and what's going on with innocent Israelis and those Palestinians that are innocent, and people being ousted from their homes as a result of what's going on, and vicious attacks by terrorist organizations, and what has happened to Israel with the Hamas invasion and all that, and the displacement that brings about. God put nations, this is interesting, Rashi is saying this, by the way, God put these nations in front of Avram, right? Yiten lefanav goyim u'malachim. And God gave him the opportunity to show his faith in God. Remember the stories of Paro, and he says, Sarah is my sister, and all of that. So the one from the east, mi he'ir mi hamizrach, is the one whom righteousness accompanied. Otosha tzedek yikrohu leraglo. He is going to be the one that God is going to choose. So at this very difficult time in the life of the Jewish people, Isaiah is making a parallel to the uncertainty in Avram's life. We talk about his tests, his triumphs, what we learned from him, the important lessons. But now we're focusing on his vulnerability. That's what the Haftara is putting before us. So Avram went on his way. He did what he had to do. It says, Yerdafam Yavor Shalom. He pursued them, and he passed on safely. In other words, he met the tests, he met the 4 kings, he comes into the middle of this war, and he will be successful. But it's important to remember, this is a path which he did not know. He had never been on with his feet, a road that he had never been on. In other words, he wasn't accustomed to this. Remember, people lived basically in tribal isolation. And now, here he is being confronted by this war between these different kingdoms. Again, sound familiar. People who live in quiet settlements or quiet communities or quiet villages or what have you. And then war just takes over. In Bereshit, in our text, in chapter 14, we are in the midst of a war between the kings and Avram, so to speak. Is caught in the middle of these unfamiliar circumstances and unfamiliar territory. And Isaiah will parallel this with how this is impacting the people of his generation. So we go back to chapter 14 of Bereshit. The fugitive comes, he tells Avram, Vayavo hapalit vayigad la'Avram ha'ivri, the Hebrew. And where was he? He was living in the plain of Mamre. And we are told that this fugitive was actually Og. This is according to Rashi and according to the Midrash, Bereshit Rabbah, who escaped from the battle, and that he's the one who also escaped from the generation of the flood. So he's the one that comes and lets Avram know what is going on, and perhaps to give him perspective. In the meantime, understand that Avram is homeless. Avram is without land. Avram is wandering. Avram is definitely in the most challenging and vulnerable position possible. Avram hears in verse 14 that his kinsmen have been taken captive. Vayishma Avram ki nishba achav. And he arms his trained men that were born in his house, and he pursues them. And we're actually told later that everyone who was part of Avram's house, including Yishmael, everyone who was brought up in Avram's house, will be rewarded because they were taught the basic fundamentals, the basic foundations of what it means to be a human being, of what it is to have faith, of what it is to somehow balance what one needs to do in terms of one's own safety and well-being with concern for others, as we see with Sdom and Amorah, and as we see in other instances as well. Here we see Avram navigating uncharted territory in every possible way, interacting with nations that are strange to him, traveling in places foreign and in every way outside of his comfort zone. And he is confronting daunting challenges that will viscerally threaten his very survival. As this portion of Yeshayahu begins with the words of comfort for those who are suffering the perils of exile, just as Avram is suffering in unknown situations in which he does not have a firm grounding. The lesson is that only through perseverance and the strength of faith will one be carried through these challenging situations, as is often the case in our lives. Lech, Lecha, and we've talked about this before. Go for your own sake. You're going into the unknown. You're leaving the comfort of your past. You're leaving what is known for the unknown. But it's for your sake. It may not seem like this. It may not seem that this is the best thing for you right now. But in the long run, it will be. And at this point, I've often mentioned our parents, our grandparents, the generations of our families who had to flee their homes because of persecution, because of horrible situations. And we are alive and we are living and we are thriving today because of those actions. And it really also encourages a midor lador kind of dynamic from generation to generation. Many of us are living the lives our parents or our grandparents or our great-grandparents, depending on how close. Some of us are closer than others. But we're living the lives that they could not live. But they did what they did so that we could have these lives. Are you willing to take that chance? This may be the unspoken question to Avram. And his answer is to place all of his faith and belief in God for his own sake and for that of the future. Here our prophet Yeshayahu is looking back to lessons from the past that should now be utilized at this juncture in Jewish history in which he finds himself. The Haftara begins with a question that hints at what can happen when we forget our past. V'lama tomar Yaakov v'tdaber Yisrael b'sitra? Why should you say, O Jacob, and speak Yisrael in secret? My way has been hidden. Why should you say that my way has been hidden from God? Does God not know everything we do? Remember, it may seem like our rega katan, our small moment at present, but we are challenged to look at the larger scheme of things to see our part in those terms. Remembering the lessons and the chances taken in the past for our sake, and the lessons that we still have to learn and amplify, and chances we still have to take for the sake of future generations as well. At this point, we read, and we use both names of Yaakov and Yisrael. Remember, Yaakov has two names. Yaakov on the heel and Yisrael struggling with God. Note that both of these names are being used here. We will see this often. And what I often like to say is think about the idea that we have public personalities and private personalities. Our family may call us a nickname. We may go out there and professionally have a more formal name. We continue. Verse 28. Halo yadata imo shamata? Do you know that if you have not heard, an everlasting God is the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth. God does not tire nor weary. There's no fathoming God's understanding. Again, in our uncharted territories, taking children, people are refugees. I mean, again, it's not difficult to make the connection to today. Maybe you haven't heard. Maybe you're not aware of God. But that doesn't mean that God's not there. We continue the text. Barei katzot haaretz v'chulei. God is the creator of the ends of the earth. There is no way to contain everything that God is. And the one who can do that, who can contain all the earth and have such strength and wisdom, God knows your thoughts. Why does God make you go through these problems? Again, see this as a dialogue between Avram's angst and Avram's uncertainty in his journey and the people of the exile, their uncertainty and their angst, and Isaiah trying to help them through their journey, and then carry that through various periods of history until today. So who is this God? And at this point, the prophet, who is one of the prophets of social justice, is telling us, Noten l'yav koach. God gives the tired strength. You will be tired. You will be exhausted. You will have questions. But God will help you. Ubacharim kashol yichshalu. And young men will stumble, will make mistakes. But, v'atem, k'vei Hashem tachlipu koach. You put your strength, you put your faith in God, your hope in God, and you will have koach hadash v'chazak, new and stronger power. You must have faith in God when you don't see the path before you. The prophet is reminding us all that, again, there is this rega katan, this small moment in our perspective. And while in our perspective, that small moment, the moment we are all going through right now, is cataclysmic, and we don't see our way out of it. I don't. I mean, I'm saying these words, but I don't. But for God, it's part of a much larger picture of what is prevalent and present. By invoking the historical legacy of this people and reminding them of all that they and their forefathers have already gone through, the prophet, the Navi, Hebrew word, Navi, Lahavi, who brings the word of God, is trying to encourage and guide them in looking past the Rega Katan, this small moment of catastrophe, and see their experiences through God's eyes. Returning to the Haftara, remember we started with Avram. We mentioned his roots. Lech is about his roots. That's the connection of this Haftara with this Torah reading portion. But you, my servant, Israel, V'ata Yisrael, de Yaakov. Again, both names, right? We present ourselves differently in different situations. You, my Israel, my servant, Yaakov, whom I've chosen, the seed of Abraham, who loved me, you I will take care of. You I will provide for. You will not have to have any terrible worries. Notice the many challenges in these complicated human constellations. Yaakov goes through so much. Yitzchak goes through so much. All of the Avot, the Imahat, and those that we stopped talking about, Yishmael and Esau, everybody goes through so much, and we'll hear more about that in the weeks to come. God is always there watching, and all is part of the drama that God is fully aware of, whereas we, ourselves, may only see things from where we are in our limited capacity. This is understandable. One of my frustrations and a great sadness in my heart these days is that I value and I'm heartened by my interfaith work. And when we look at the vitriol that's in our world today, this Rega Katan, this small moment, can destroy everything. And that is obviously very disheartening and very upsetting. What is particularly painful to me is those in my multi-faith world where I will sit and listen to different perspectives. I try to hold all of the truths that different people have simultaneously. But I will not hold my truth either. I must come to the table with my truth. And I literally had the experience where one of my colleagues who talked on and on and on, a Muslim man who I've done a lot of work with, whom I pride and I cherish our relationship, was very adamant about his position. And then when I said, after listening for quite a while, do you want to hear mine? He was like, no, because you're wrong. And if you don't believe like me, then you're a hypocrite. And I don't want to get into the politics. You can imagine who was talking what. God then calls through the prophet on those things that last forever. Remember, we talked about that last week. You call on the islands, you call on the water, you call on the heavens, and even at the end of Devarim. These things will last forever. And they see what is going on. We think of them as inanimate objects. But it's interesting, if you've ever been involved in an archaeological dig, the ground talks. And the ground gives us documentation for many generations of life, of conflict, of progress, of destruction, of so much. If we know our history, we know what to do when we see certain patterns come up. We cannot escape what happened in the past, but hopefully we can use it to forge a new future. And that's what I'm always trying to do. And those of us that try to hold and somehow negotiate everybody's different truths and not shut people down are particularly frustrated at this moment in time and particularly sad. There have been tears involved. The prophet then goes on and talks about how one gets strength and how one maintains one's faith. And a little bit later says, and you, Israel, V'ata Yisrael Avdi, again, the reference to Yaakov Yisrael, Avram Shaloya Mizera Tzadikim. Avraham, your grandfather, was not descended from righteous men. And yet I did this all for him and for you, my servant, who belong to me. Zera Abraham Ohavi, the prophet says. The seed of Abraham has loved me. They didn't come to me out of yerah, out of awe or fear, but out of love. And we're told in the chapters that give us the life of Avram and his family, as I said earlier, everyone in that family will be rewarded because Avram taught them the love of God. I took you. Now, we're still in the Haftara, and now the Haftara returns to the present after evoking the past and setting down the roots. I took you from the ends of the earth, from the other nations, and I called you by name, and I am here for you. Do not fear, al tira ki imaka ani. Do not be fearful, I am with you. Do not be discouraged, I am your God. I've encouraged you, I've helped you, I've supported you. Al tishta, don't let your heart be discouraged. Don't let it melt like wax. All those who fight against you and don't understand you, they will get theirs. So this idea is seen as very problematic in my multi-faith world for all the obvious reasons. But I think we need to realize that, again, we're holding multiple truths. Any parent who has any number of children, 2, 3, 4, 5, knows that each child has their own experience of the parenting, of the sibling dynamics, of the family itself. Same family. I remember, and I think I've used this image, a psychologist once told me years ago, they were doing marriage therapy, and the wife would come in and talk about her experience. The husband would come in and talk about his experience. He's going, wait a minute, I've got to check my notes. There's no way they're married to each other. But they were. They just had very, very, very different perspectives of what happened and how each one's actions impacted on the other. And we're looking at this on steroids today in our world on many levels. How do we not get discouraged? So the answer here is from the prophet during exile. Don't lose your faith in God. So Yeshayahu, Isaiah, in his artistry of words, has now shown that in Avram, who then becomes Abraham, is the history of his past, and that all nations and all roots are still interconnected. We are all B'nai Adam, the children of Adam v'Chava, in the inherited experiences of our past. Lech, Lecha. In the past, we have spoken about what Avram did not take with him. But here Yeshayahu is reminding us what he did take with him. Faith in God, remembering the history, a sense that something is going to be different, even in the midst of the unknown and the scary and the horrible and the incredibly frightening experiences that may confront him. What he did take with him was the legacy of all those who came before him. This is true for all of us. As we balance the charting out of our own path with the historical precedents and lessons that led us to where we are at this point. In accepting the dating of this prophet, Yeshayahu, at this point, as the 6th century before the Common Era, B'nai Yisrael, B'nai Yaakov Yisrael, has been in exile for decades. All that grounded them, their temple, the Beit HaMikdash, the kingdom, the land, is not there. They are homeless. They are landless. As was Avram. I heard something very interesting on a podcast or something about someone making the distinction between being homeless and houseless. Not being tied to a location, but if home is your family, and if home is the people around you, and if home is in your heart. I saw last night, I've been watching channel 1118, Israeli News, and they had one of the displaced families from one of the kibbutzim, and he said his family was with him. They were in a hotel room in Eilat. Their community was there. He said, this is our home now. This is our home now. But all that grounded them, that said, this is your identity, the temple, the kingdom, the land, it's not there. So they have to find faith in themselves and in those around them. Going back to Bereshit, when we see that all the family members of Avram's household are blessed because they learned from Avram, Avram had to be heartened as he becomes Avraham, that the family rallied around him as well. In Yeshayahu, in Isaiah, this people are trotting on unfamiliar ground towards an unknown future, as had Avraham Avinu so long ago. They will need the same perseverance, the same faith that characterized Avram Avinu. And in this, Avraham, our father, becomes our dugma, our prototypical parent, if you will, to get through the challenges and continue to forge a future that is meaningful and appropriate as the B'nai Yisrael, B'nai Yaakov, until today, and hopefully for many generations to come. Part of this dynamic which we have inherited is to understand the difference between our perspective of ourselves, the egocentric point of view that we all come to the table with, and we must, to be our best, and that of God, of Ribono Shel Olam, concerned about us individually, collectively, and as much as we each try to be the best we can, we are all, as they say, a small cog in the wheel. The Rega Katan. Rega Katan is a small moment in time, a small impact on the world, all of that. On one hand, yes, you throw that stone into the water and the ripples go out and out and out. But it's still just a small part of the totality. This understanding of God and God's largesse, and that God is concerned about us individually, collectively, and for all of B'nai Adam, is what we carry with us and we impart to others. In trying to bring these disparate ideas together, Rabbi Dr. Gidon Rothstein suggests as follows. The Midrash seems to ignore an important difference between the Jews in our Haftarah and the view of Jacob. What Isaiah sees as the Jews complaining about is that God has stopped paying attention to them, not that God is too strict with them. Assuming that the Midrash might not have gotten it wrong, we would need to understand that the Midrash equates the two attitudes in their level of error about God's impact on the world. Denying God's impact or misinterpreting it are similar enough to be lumped together. A big word today is intentionality, where we all try to check in with each other and make sure, as we learn in communications theory, what you hear is what I say, and that there's not that miscommunication. But it happens all the time. The antidote for these problems is to notice all the many ways that God intervenes in human affairs, such as by giving strength to the exhausted, as we read, and we say daily in one of our traditional morning blessings, shaping the course of world history. When the name of Avraham is invoked, it is to support the claim that our worries as a nation are unfounded, that God who chose Avraham certainly bears a continuing and positive interest in our welfare, much as events may seem to say otherwise. And that is particularly meaningful at this moment. In the Gemara, Shabbat 156b takes chapter 41, verse 2 in the Haftarah's reference to God as the one who brought justice out of the east, as part of a surprising story about Avraham. Avraham, in this read, according to the Gemara, did not believe that God could give him offspring because the stars said otherwise. Remember, we talk about Avram as the first monotheist and believing in God, but remember where he comes from, okay? Any one of us who has passed down a recipe from 5 generations ago in our family knows that we come with certain markers that we just continue to use and we continue to grow with them. It was at this stage that God taught Avram of the divine superiority to astrology, to which he was much more accustomed. Avram had indeed rejected worshiping other gods, but thought that nature, as revealed by the stars, sets limits on even what God could do. And many scientists are studying this today. Isaac's birth, however, taught him that God does exert absolute control, even to the breaking of what seems to be the absolutely necessary future as being told. So, to wrap up, in Avram's time, in the time of Yeshayahu, and in our troubling times as well, our rega katan, the small moment that is zapping up all of our energy and taking all of our breath away, may indeed try to take over or eclipse the larger picture. But in the end, Lecha, we must all continue to go forward, remembering that Ribono Shel Olam is watching us. I know this to be true. October 15th, the first Sunday after the Chagim, there were lots and lots and lots of Jewish weddings. Many of us were at Jewish weddings. And at the Jewish wedding I was at, this very wise Rabbi Larry Rothwachs said that we may feel guilty, or we may feel like it's a diversion, or what have you, to go to a wedding during such a horrible time. But he said, no, this is what we as Jews do. This is our answer to what is going on. When that Rega Katan seems to try to eclipse all of us, we continue to live, to celebrate, to create, and grow. May we all recognize that perseverance is critical to moving on, and that the big picture should be kept, at least in our conscience on some level, so that we are not completely wrapped up and devastated by the Rega Katan, by the catastrophic small moments. Shabbat Shalom, and may we all be blessed to rise to the challenges that are placed before us, as did Avram, and as did the generation of Yeshayahu. Lehitraot.